Darwin arrived back in England fairly well known already because of his dispatches from his cruise. He sent letters, he sent specimens that he collected en route and sent them back and commented on them, and so he was fairly well known. In fact, as early as 1839 it was that he was elected to the Royal Society as a fellow. So quite a young man for such an achievement. And I have, as I said, read a lot of Darwin's works, and it's very enlightening, but it's very frustrating as well. So for example, when you read Voyage Around the World on Beagle, or you read his actual notebooks, he gets to the edge of articulating the theory. And so many times in the margins I write, just say it, Charles. God. And it's important because there's a contention that, as we're going to get to in a minute, that he shares the idea of evolution through natural selection. But again, I'm going to get back to that in a few minutes. After returning, the expectation was that he would formulate and articulate in public the theory, but he didn't. And there were several reasons, one of which was he was fastidious. He was a scientist. He was a skeptic. He had the idea, but he doubted himself very, very appropriately. And he did this for several reasons, one of which was, as I said before, he was trained in theology, and he knew there was a threat, and it was called the Church of England. He had to have done his homework when he went public, or he would have been chewed up politically. So not only did he need observational evidence, he needed experimental empirical evidence, that which he controlled himself in controlled experiments. So the second suggestion I'm going to make to you is that you must visit Down House. It is thrilling. It's been restored to the original, and going through Darwin's study, going through his reading room where music was played, taking the walk that Darwin took every day of his life is spine tingling. It's a wonderful experience. And to see his experiment, which is, the apparatus is still there that he did with the worms, his domestication of plants in the greenhouse is just absolutely phenomenal. And so yes, he collected lots of his own data, which he analyzed and utilized. There's a second reason he didn't publish, and that was because of his friend Joseph Hooker, who basically was all about hazing. He said, young men, you don't need to be famous right away. You need to pay your dues, and you need to be a naturalist and prove yourself, prove your mettle. So Charles Darwin was very busy organizing barnacles for 8 years. So he's really squared away with barnacles and felt that he had paid his dues. And most importantly, 1838, Charles Darwin wrote a book by Malthus concerning populations, struggle, and variation. Populations within species tend to grow. They eat resources, predators eat them, and at some point the environment changes, and so those which did not change go away, those which can deal with the new environment stay. Another person who read Malthus at about the same time was Wallace, who was in the archipelago in the southwest, and we'll get to him in a few minutes. Another little known fact, busy at the time with becoming the father of modern genetics, Gregor Mendel was a busy man with his genetic experiments. He actually sent a manuscript to Charles Darwin. We're told in school that the two never met, the two didn't know each other. In fact, we didn't discover Mendel's works until well into the 20th century. But Mendel tried. He sent his document to Charles Darwin in Down. And unfortunately, Darwin's German was not that good, and he struggled. He couldn't get through the document, and we have no evidence that he benefited from Mendel's work, although obviously in the great synthesis, the modern synthesis, we have benefited gigantically from Gregor Mendel. In 1842, Charles Darwin inked out his first sketch of the theory, 1842, and it was about 35 pages. By 1844, he had expanded that to over 200 pages. So not made public, but in those days we didn't have what we do today, which is called peer review. He wrote the document, his friends were well aware of it, it was discussed, and therefore by those standards that day, like with Newton or anyone else, it basically was articulated. The intellectual property was his. Everything changed in 1858, Charles Darwin received a letter from Wallace articulating Charles Darwin's theory. This was problematic in that Darwin had waited so long, had written in his notebooks in order to frustrate me to death, all about the theory but not the theory. But this changed everything. His friend Lyell arranged for Charles Darwin and for Wallace to co-present their theory at the Linnaean Society, and it happened. And by the way, in honor of that, there are no PowerPoints today. We're doing it the way Darwin did it and the way Wallace did it, except for one thing. Another tidbit about Darwin, he was a very reserved man, as a scientist should be, I think. Some call him modest. From what I read, I don't get that. I think very, very reserved. He was the equivalent of a justice of the peace. He was very involved in his community in Down, which is a lovely little town with a wonderful little pub, I should say. So this basically became Darwin's schedule, this revelation from Wallace. And so in 1859, he published Origins of Species. Very ironically, he also sent his manuscript to the London Times Book Review. And the usual editor, the usual book reviewer, was not there that day. And I understand that he was irascible, didn't like anything, more than skeptical, downright hateful, was not there that day. But a man named Huxley was there. He would turn out to be a gigantic Darwin supporter. He read the manuscript and exclaimed, "How stupid that we never thought of this. How obvious is this?" And you know the rest of the story. So at this point, we begin to have a biologically informed medicine. I'll give you an interesting factoid. We in this country alone spend about $30 billion a year chasing evolution medically. That's right. Those little bugs that mutate, they get away from us. We need a new pharmaceutical compound, and so about $30 billion a year chasing evolution, but happily so. In Origin of Species, Charles Darwin only referred to man as possibly subject to evolution in one sentence. He indicated that he hoped his works and that of others would throw light on man's origins and his history. It would be the second book in 1871 that he focused like a laser on the human as subject to natural selection. But he also added sexual selection, which deserves a lecture of its own. I'm not going to talk about sexual selection today. The book, The Origin itself, had sold out multiply. It continues today to sell out. It's quite a hit. But Darwin was beginning to focus on the Church of England and how he was going to sell his idea and stay alive. There were lots of debates, and you know the debate with Wilberforce and others, and they were quite intellectual, but the evolutionists were slowly winning. They were slowly winning the day. They were winning the minds of countrymen and in the United States as well, and ultimately all over the world. So this was 138 years ago, 1871, The Descent of Man. Gosh, Darwin himself speculated that we probably originated in sub-Saharan Africa, and this was confirmed by the Leakeys and by Dart and by others. It was Darwin who originally speculated on this. But what was most important about this book was that he noticed similarities and differences in 4 characteristics of living creatures. The first were their structures. Species and near species look kind of alike. How interesting. Their reproductive habits, their development, life history, those milestones that we go through in order to go from infant to adult, and most importantly, behavior.